Chapter 10. I was so upset when we arrived home. I was numb. Nothing could bring me out of it. Not my old dog, Nero, nor the stew my grandfather was cooking, nor my warm, soft bed. My pain was beyond tears. I awoke the following morning to a soft knocking at my door. At first I was confused by my surroundings. Then, all in the space of a moment, I felt elation. I was back in my old room, and then grief, as the events from the previous day came back to me. My brother Antonio came in, carrying a cup of milk. "Here, this is warm. Drink it. You'll feel better," he said gently. I leaned forward and took a sip. It tasted good, and I realized how hungry I was. I emptied the cup. "I'll come down to the shop soon," I said, "as soon as I dress." "You don't have to. Come down when you're ready." "But father will want me there." Antonio took the cup from me and straightened my bedclothes. "Don't worry," he said. "Things are under control in the shops." "Thanks," I murmured. "I will come down later." After he left, I got out of bed and dressed. I found my old sketch pad and pencil and headed toward the gallery window. I figured it was the only thing that might take my mind off what had happened. The market was as busy as ever. I looked around for a good subject for a drawing and spotted an old woman dressed in black, a widow. She was selling eggs from a basket, and next to her was a small crate of chicks, which were also for sale. As I sketched, one of the chicks managed to hop on the edge of the crate and then down to the ground. The old woman cursed and snatched up the chick, dropping it back in the crate. I was reminded of Melania. Then memories of the studio and the commission crowded my thoughts. It was no use trying to draw. I couldn't concentrate at all. I went back to my room and lay on my bed. I recalled the events of that last day, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. The maestro had accused me of telling the Duke that the sketch was not his work. I had never even spoken with the Duke. In fact, I hadn't mentioned my feelings about it to anyone. Someone must have invented the story and lied to the maestro. Donato? No, I was sure that he hadn't said anything. I remembered the Duke's comment. The maestro is a good teacher. His apprentice here is able to follow his style exactly, though he seems to add something of his own to the work. Perhaps at that moment the Duke realized the work was Donato's. But if he had gone to the maestro about it, then he wouldn't have said that I told him anything. My name wouldn't have come up at all. I dozed off, and Antonio woke me again as night fell. "Arduino," he said, nudging me. "Yes, yes," I started to wake. "Relax. Nothing is happening. I brought you some rolls and honey." I took one of the rolls, broke off a piece, and drizzled it with honey. Antonio sat on the edge of my bed and watched me eat. "I've been tricked, Antonio," I said in between bites. "I didn't say anything. I swear it. Someone hates me, and now I won't be able to study anywhere. No one will have me as his apprentice." "Don't torture yourself with worry," he said. "Things will work themselves out." But I couldn't stop worrying about it. That night, when I was feeling more rested, I went over all the details again of my last day as the maestro's apprentice. I had spent the morning preparing drawings for Donato to trace with carbon on the wall. "Tomorrow we will paint the background," Donato had said. "You will be responsible for this corner." "Me, maestro?" Everyone had laughed when I called him maestro, except Marco, who glared at me. I recalled the Duke's visit later that day and my conversation with Bianca. I had returned to the maestro's after that. I remember talking with Baldo in the studio and seeing Marco, who ran out as soon as I went in. Marco. It had to have been him. He had told the maestro the story, out of hatred and envy. It all fit together. Marco spoke to the Duke before leaving the palace grounds and then told the maestro that I had betrayed him. The maestro sent Piero to find my father, and when Donato and I returned, he sent Donato out on an errand to keep him out of the way. Yes, it all seemed clear now, though it didn't lessen the dead feeling I had in this pit of my stomach. I wondered whether the Duke had actually canceled the commission. He had seemed so pleased with the way things were progressing. Of course, whether it was canceled or not wouldn't affect me. The maestro regarded me as a traitor in any case. My only hope was that Donato would tell the maestro what had really happened. Donato knew the truth. The next day I helped listlessly in the kitchen and in the tailor shop, where I sat on a low stool near a window, basting gold cord on the wide sleeves of a ceremonial doublet. When evening fell, my brothers tried to cheer me up. "Would you like some chestnuts, Arduino? I've just roasted them." From where he sat, Enzo held out a deck of cards. "Would you like to play? I dare you to 10 games." Despite their kindness, I shook my head. Nothing could relieve my despair. Even Nero tried to console me, curling up at my feet. Only my father seemed not to see me. The next morning I joined my grandfather in the courtyard. We sat together by the fountain. A pale sun peeked out from the clouds, painting weak shadows on the cobblestones. "Another spring," he said, pointing to the first buds on the branches of our almond tree. My grandfather counted the springs. Were they the ones he had lived or the ones he had left to live? I felt an overwhelming sadness. All I had left to look forward to was counting the springs, one after another, taking my life with them. From where we sat, we could hear some activity going on at the front of the house. "Your father is expecting a client," my grandfather explained. A while later, Antonio shouted to me from an open window, "Arduino, come inside to the great room." I looked at grandfather. What had I done now? He patted my back. "Go on, Arduino." In the middle of the great room, seated in our finest chair, the one reserved for honored guests and clients, was the Duke of Algora. He was wearing his woolen cloak and held a gold-headed staff in his hand. My father stood next to him. "Arduino, the Duke has come to speak with you," he said, beckoning me over with his hand. I knelt before the Duke, my head bowed. "My lord, I'm sorry." "Stand up, my boy," interrupted the Duke. "I'm not here for an apology. I've spoken with Cosima de Forli, and it seems that Donato needs you for the work in the chapel. As you know, it must be finished by June." My heart leapt. So the commission had not been cancelled. I stood up slowly, my eyes still averted. The Duke went on. "I'm aware that there was a little, how shall I say, misunderstanding. Yes, that's the word. But fortunately that has been cleared up. Your father and I have discussed things, and he has agreed to allow you to return to the studio to help finish the chapel painting." I couldn't believe my ears. What about the maestro? My father had said he would never let me go back to the studio, but I looked at him and he nodded. "You have my permission, Arduino," he said softly. Somehow the truth had come to light. But why was my father letting me go back? Now didn't seem the time to ask questions. "Father, you know this is what I want, more than anything." "I know that, son." He came over and hugged me. "I believe you will be a wonderful painter some day." I squeezed him tightly, then stepped back and knelt again before the Duke. "My lord, thank you," I said. "I am deeply honored." "Then go and gather up your things," he said. "You will return with me to the palace chapel, where your maestro awaits you." I think my feet hardly touched the ground on the way to my bedroom, where I hurriedly packed some clothes in my old satchel. After a round of warm goodbyes and good wishes from my father, brothers, and grandfather, I followed the Duke out to his carriage. There were at least 100 questions buzzing in my head as we rode toward the palace. How had everything been resolved? How would the maestro receive me? What about Marco? I didn't dare ask anything of the Duke. It would have been too forward, so I sat there wondering silently as we bounced along the cobblestone streets. As if he were reading my thoughts, the Duke said, "I know you're curious as to how all this came about. Just wait until we get to the palace. Donato is there, and he will tell you what has transpired." He crossed his arms and in a bemused tone of voice added, "A rather unusual course of events, I should say." When we reached the palace grounds, the Duke instructed me to go to the chapel, where I would find Donato. I thanked him, and with satchel in hand, ran across the lawn and down the familiar path that led to the chapel. I pulled open the heavy door and looked in. For an instant, it was as if I were seeing the chapel for the first time. The spring sunlight that passed through the stained glass windows created a vision of color. In the back, behind the altar, was Donato, adjusting a scaffold. He hadn't heard me come in. "Maestro!" I called. My voice echoed through the chapel. Donato looked up from his work. "You're here!" He hurriedly stepped over boards and other debris from painting, and I ran up to the altar. We met and embraced. Though only a few days had passed, it seemed like a lifetime since last we'd seen each other. "Come up here," he said, pointing toward the fresco. "We have much to talk about, and much work to do." I stopped. "Donato, tell me," I said. "It was Marco, wasn't it? He was the one who betrayed the maestro to the Duke, then blamed it on me." He sighed, and we both sat down on the altar step. "Yes, it was Marco," he said. "Piero heard him tell the maestro his lie, though at the time Piero didn't know it was a lie. He said he found it hard to believe that you would do such a thing, and knowing that you and I were friends, he came to me about it. Later I tried to talk with Maestro, but it was impossible. He was in a blind rage." "Then what happened to change Cosima's mind?" I asked. "Well, the Duke came by the studio the next morning. He was furious with the maestro for misrepresenting his work. When it came out that Marco was the one who had betrayed him, Cosima was stunned. The Duke made it clear, however, that the most important thing to him was to see the chapel fresco completed for his daughter's wedding. He knew the work was mine, and because I'm in the employ of Cosimo's studio, the Duke did not cancel the commission. I talked to the Duke about you and how I needed your help to finish the work. I explained how you had been sent home, wrongly banished from Cosimo's studio. When I told him your name, he said he knew your father and that he would go and speak with him personally to talk about your returning to the studio, but as my apprentice. What? Your apprentice? Officially? How can it be? I was so excited I was babbling. Donato laughed. Well, let me finish, he said, then paused before he went on. His voice became more serious. As everyone now knows, Cosimo is too ill to continue running his studio. He spoke with me candidly and said he may not have long to live. Arduino, he has decided to turn the studio over to me. Donato, that's marvelous. You deserve it more than anybody. Even if Cosimo were well enough to continue, Donato added, his reputation would suffer terribly from this incident with the Duke. And what about Marco? I asked. As you can probably guess, the maestro gave Marco a fair hearing, then threw him out on his ear. He has gone back to his family and, I suppose, a career in the military. I feel sorry for him. Then Donato's voice brightened. As for the others, they are all staying on. All of them. Baldo, Piero, and Melania, and me. The chapel door opened and the Duke strode in. Both Donato and I rose from where we sat. I hope you've had a chance to catch up on things, he said. Arduino, Donato is modest, so I will tell you myself. Your future will be secure as his apprentice, because I plan to keep his studio busy for quite some time. Donato and I looked at each other. His eyes were shining. The Duke continued. I would like Donato to supervise the decoration of the ceilings and walls throughout the palace, he said. Then, turning to Donato, he added, if you agree, of course, maestro. It will be my life's work, my lord. The Duke smiled at both of us and left. Donato turned to me. Arduino, he said, I have to thank you for all this good fortune. You are a brave and loyal friend. I was thinking the same of you, maestro, I replied. Later on, after several hours of painting, I went for a walk in the beautiful garden that surrounded the palace. I needed to breathe freely and put my thoughts into order. All of the disappointments, jealousies, nightmares, and fears dissolved into an old dream, now nearly forgotten. A sweet calm filled my soul. I had an extraordinary maestro and my father's blessing to study art. What more could I hope for? The light of day turned violet and the shadows softened. At the end of the stone pathway, near a door, a group of men with ropes and pulleys was lifting into place an ancient statue that had been recently restored. When I passed them, the sculptor who was directing their labors looked at me and with a smile on his bearded face said, Ah, youth! What I would give to have your freedom again. I bowed to him and continued back to the chapel.